As I'm sure most of you know, from all the Dark Souls 3 gameplay I use in the background of my horror stories, I'm a little obsessed with this game. I've been watching a lot of lore videos, and as interesting as the Dark Souls universe is, I started to notice the parallels between the story in the game and human history. And even more so, I have a theory that Dark Souls 3 itself is a critique of the modern world. I understand that not everyone plays Dark Souls, so I'm going to cover this video on a no prior knowledge basis. Also, keep in mind, this video is meant to be taken with a grain of salt. I love to see what you guys think, so be sure to continue the discussion in the comment section. And one last thing to keep in mind is that I'm arguing from an American perspective, but a lot of what I say applies to just about all of the Western world in general. To start off, let's begin with the fire. Before the first flame, in the Age of Ancients, the world was dark and ruled by everlasting dragons. But then, the advent of fire occurred, in which the first flame was created, and with it came heat and cold, life and death, and light and dark. From the dark came humanoid creatures. These creatures absorbed the power of the first flame to transform into 4 legendary figures. Led by a lord named Gwyn, they would go on to defeat the everlasting dragons, ushering in the Age of Fire. Eventually, the fire began to fade, and Lord Gwyn sacrificed himself to link the fire, prolonging the Age of Fire in the process. The Dark Souls games all revolve around the linking of the fire. This is a cyclical process that continually demands sacrifice in order to continue the Age of Fire. Well, what the hell does this have to do with history? Let's think about history for a minute. Is history not cyclical as well? I'm sure most of you have seen that picture. Weak men create hard times create strong men create good times, and good times create weak men. While this is an oversimplified way of saying it, the message of this idea, I believe, is correct. If you accept that history as well as the relinking of the fire are similarly cyclical, what does the linking of the fire mean as far as human history is concerned? What's the parallel? Well, I think there's quite a few things you could draw the comparison to, and if you guys disagree or think something else is more fitting, feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section. But I'm going to argue that the equivalent of the linking of the fire is fighting in a war. I know, it sounds crazy, but just hear me out. Linking of the fire is often seen as self-sacrificial and virtuous, much the way generations of the past romanticized war. It wasn't that long ago that dying for your country in a war was seen as the ultimate patriotic sacrifice. One of the greatest German military leaders in the 1800s, Moltke the Elder, once said, "Perpetual peace is a dream and not a pleasant one at that. War is a part of God's plan. In it, the most noble virtues in man unfold. Courage, self-denial, devotion to duty, self-sacrifice. Without war, the world will be mired in materialism." I think this quote perfectly sums up the way humanity felt about war a few hundred years ago. All these great virtues of man come into play when you fight in a war, and even if you die, you still got to reach some level of virtue that is unattainable without fighting in the first place. Secondly, I think what he said about materialism is accurate as well. Us in the Western world, without a doubt, have drowned in materialism, as a fraction of us still retain the virtues our forefathers once held with abundance and pride. For the most part, the now coming to age millennials are spoiled and self-entitled, having been raised in a relatively cushy life. Our biggest obstacles in life are those we create for ourselves. From eating disorders to drug addiction, we create these poor environments for ourselves because we never really had to fight for or in anything. We never had to become part of something bigger than ourselves, which a great war would fix. And I don't mean something like the smaller wars that have been going on the last few decades where only the active military participate. I'm talking about the wars where the entire society is pushed to its limits, something like World War II. All the able-bodied men went over to fight. The women stepped up and filled those factories and helped grow food for the war effort. Large portions of society willingly sacrificed their own happiness and pleasure for something greater than themselves. And I'm not talking about something like Desert Storm, where we go over and smack around a joke of a nation and we end up with a fraction of the casualties with a victory that's so intense you could accurately describe it as a blowout. In the Dark Souls worlds, when you link the fire, you become kindled or a Lord of Cinder, which is seen as a great honor. But it comes at a great cost to yourself because you're essentially using your body as a candle to link the flame. You're basically sacrificing yourself for the Age of Fire to continue. I think this piece of dialogue perfectly sums up how common folks in the Dark Souls world feel about those who have linked the fire.
Ah, another one roused from the sleep of death. Well, you're not alone. We unkindled are worthless. Can't even die right. Gives me conniptions. And they'd have us seek the Lords of Cinder and return them to their moulding thrones. But we are talking true legends with the metal to link the fire. We're not fit to lick their boots. Don't you think?
Another important thing to note about the story of Dark Souls 3 is that the Lords of Cinder, as well as the rest of the unkindled ash or common folks, are unwilling as well as incapable of linking the fire. The reason you kill the Lords of Cinder in Dark Souls 3 is because they were resurrected once again to link the fire, but they refuse to do so. The backstories of the bosses are a bit too long for this video, but I do want to focus on one in particular. The last Lord of Cinder you fight, Prince Lothric and Lorien. These two princes are brothers and Lorien was originally chosen to link the fire, but he was deemed unfit to do so by the elites of Lothric. Instead, they placed all their hopes into Prince Lothric, who was born a sickly child. Prince Lothric outright rejects the responsibility to link the fire as he refers to it as a curse. I think this is the strongest evidence to draw the parallels for my little theory here, as Prince Lothric was raised by the nobility with every advantage in the world to fulfill his prophecy. Yet, weak and sickly as he is, rejects the only thing he's asked to do, which is quite similar to modern society in a few aspects. Modern technology has given our generation every advantage in the world to fight the next great war. Yet, we refuse to do so and even go as far to demonize those who encourage war. You don't have to go far back at all to find resentment for war, which normally takes form when citizens disrespect soldiers. Another important point I want to bring up is that pleasure and peace breed weakness. If you've never had to struggle and you were given everything in the world you wanted, you would probably be lazy and unfulfilled. It's only through struggling and fighting and suffering that you can become a better version of yourself. This concept comes full circle when you think about the gameplay of Dark Souls itself. Those of you who play already know, but for those of you who don't, the game is extremely difficult. I'm on my third playthrough of the game and there are still times I get stuck on certain areas or boss fights. This helps to make you a better player because absolutely nothing is handed to you. When you beat a boss in that game, you beat it. That's largely why the game is such a success. Nothing is handed to you and you actually need to challenge yourself as a player to progress on to the next area. I mean, even the story is like that. You have to go digging through item descriptions and obscure dialogue to even have a clue of what's going on. There are loads of lore videos out there piecing it all together, and even then, it's hard to be 100% sure about anything. And I think at the end of the day, whether we consciously acknowledge it or not, people like the struggle, the thrill of the hunt, because on some level we all know the greater the challenge, the greater the reward. Think about how you felt after you overcame some great obstacle or challenge, maybe graduating high school or finally getting a promotion at that job you've been working for 4 years. The things that require a significant investment of time and effort are those that feel the greatest. Now compare that feeling to the feeling you get after you binge watch 3 seasons of Breaking Bad on Netflix. Let's think about the rise and decline of civilizations here for a second. An accurate analogy is thinking of a rising civilization as someone wearing wooden shoes climbing a ladder. Then they get to the top, everything is great, and it isn't too long before your civilization becomes soft and weak. And before you know it, you've become a silk slippers climbing down kind of society. And the struggle of our generation is going to be how we can socially engineer ourselves into becoming the wooden shoes going up again. I think we can all agree We're long past the wooden shoes phase and we're some ways into the silk slippers going down. We're lazy, materialistic, and at the top of every industry and every market is one form or another of instant gratification. Things that appeal to our worst behaviors and tendencies. What's the most profitable food establishment? Places like McDonald's that make you unhealthy. What's the most popular thing on the internet? Porn. What's the most popular genre of fiction? Romance and erotica. What kind of video games are the most popular? Low skill gap games with no room for creativity or original thought, and generally speaking, if you've played one game, you've played them all. Do you see what I mean about instant gratification? And I'm not saying that these things are inherently evil, but they do make us weaker, less effective human beings. And if we continue down this route, it's only going to get worse. The more we indulge in these activities, the weaker we become as people, and the society we're part of becomes weaker as an extension of that. And if we don't do something about this gradual decline in culture and civilization, the gradual decline will continue until it becomes a steep decline, and then the Western worlds will eventually fall as a whole. Remember earlier when I mentioned Prince Lothric? Well, there's something interesting that he says right before you fight him.
Mind you, the mantle of Lord interests me none. The fire-linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing.
From this, we know that Prince Lothric doesn't just want to avoid linking the fire, but he wants the entire process of linking the fire to be over. And there's a certain group of people in the Western world today who that kind of reminds me of. These people go by many names, many of which are quite derogatory, but I'm just going to call them the xenophiliacs. And I'm certain that many of you watching this right now know exactly who I'm talking about. People who openly celebrate the destruction of their own civilization, meanwhile celebrating the victories of others. I see a very strong similarity between these people and Prince Lothric, an outright rejection of their duties, celebrating their own destruction, and general incompetence. Okay, so this is what we have so far. Prince Lothric and the other Lords of Cinder who reject their duty are the xenophiliacs, and the linking of the fire is fighting in a great war. But there's one major problem with this. We can't fight the next great war because of the nuclear bomb. And I bet you guys didn't think I was going to bring that up, did you? Well, I did, and that's the major reason we can't relink the flame, so to speak, in our current timeline. That's the major obstacle we have in fighting the next great war, because it would likely mean the end of civilization across the globe, leaving the planet as well as any unlucky survivors to an ominous radiation-infected hellhole. But there's also one last thing I haven't brought up yet that's kind of important, and that's what the fire itself represents. If fighting in a war relinks the fire, well, what the hell is the fire? Well, I'll tell you what it is. The Enlightenment Principles. If you were thinking that from the very beginning, pour yourself a glass of chocolate milk because you're going places, my friend. The Enlightenment Principles are the bedrock of Western civilization. It was these ideas that made the West such a great place to begin with. All the wonderful things we have today came from Enlightenment principles, things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, due process by law. There is no Western civilization without these things. Similar to the fire that ended the Age of Darkness, the Enlightened movement made the world a better place and sought to increase knowledge. This movement used reason and logic to figure out the world's problems. It gave way to the idea of human rights. As I said in the beginning of this video, in the Age of Ancients, the world was ruled by everlasting dragons. Could those dragons not represent humanity before the Enlightenment period? Fire-breathing hell beasts addicted to fighting and violence. Because before the Enlightenment, that's basically what we were. If you're cynical today, imagine how you'd feel if you were wrongfully accused of a crime and sentenced to death with no evidence that you did it. Imagine how you'd feel if your entire existence was to work land someone else owned in a position arguably worse than slavery. Imagine how you'd feel if you were burnt alive for being critical of a religious institution. The time before the first flame was a horrifying Darwinian nightmare that made death more desirable than life. Slowly but surely, the fire is fading. It's just a matter of time before we get there again. And the worst part is, there's nothing any of us can do about it.
But one day, tiny flames will dance across the darkness. like embers linked by lords past. Ashen One, hearest thou my voice still?